So as I said, she is at the University of Kent, where she is a lecturer in modern British history. I'm sure many of you know her work already. Her first book was called The Great War on the Small Screen. It was about television representations of the Great War. That appeared in 2009 from Edinburgh University Press. Her more recent book, which came out in 2020 with Cambridge University Press, was called Sounds of War: Music in the British Armed Forces During the Great War. And her lecture topic today is obviously related to that project. I'll also mention that she has been a co-investigator on two multi-year projects funded by the AHRC. The first was called Gateways to the First World War. It ran from 2014 to 2019. And then the more recent one was called Reflections on the Centenary of the First World War: Learning and Legacies for the Future. That ran from 2017. I think it ends in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, Emma. So without further ado, I'll turn the microphone over to her. And she is going to be speaking about music and its function in the British Armed Forces during the Great War.
Thank you very much, Brett and Leen, for having me. Okay, so I'm just going to try and share my screen. It's just saying host disabled participant screen sharing. Let me, you've got to give me permission to share.
Sorry, I need to look into it. How do I do this? I will make you host for a minute. I think that's the quickest way.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. Can everyone see my screen, Leen? Can you? Brilliant. Okay. So yes, thank you very much for having me. And I just really want to give a talk, or really a thinly disguised sales pitch for this latest book that came out at a wonderful time, March 2020, which was great. So I want to talk about how I originally started looking into the music and memory of the First World War as the subject of this second book. Now, at first, I focused on the big name composers so often connected with the war, men like Ralph Vaughan Williams, George Butterworth, and Arthur Bliss. However, the more research I did, the more I realised I was focusing my attention in the wrong direction. And certainly the musicologists who are quite protective of the sort of more elite music agreed. Instead of the high musical culture in the form of requiems and symphonies, the really interesting and so far relatively neglected area of study, as far as the Great War is concerned, is the role of music and the performers who worked for the maintenance of both military and civilian morale. From there, the stories of the many forgotten musicians who fought for king and country during the conflict came to the surface, and I became interested in the role of music on the fighting fronts. The more research I did, the more it became clear that I needed to study, that we needed to work on music as it happened, and it needed to reflect the multiplicity of uses and contexts that music had on the battlefields, in hospitals, in prisoners of war camps, as well as makeshift theatres and the hundreds of huts set up by voluntary aid organisations such as the YMCA, the Salvation Army and the Church Army. Then came the realisation that it was pointless just looking at the army. Not much academic work at all had been done on music in the services at sea or in the air. So in the opening of the book, I outline that the work is on musical cultures in the British Armed Forces, about the formal and informal applications of music in the military on land, sea and air during their periods of work, rest and play, in military camps, on ships, aerodromes, on the battlefields, hospitals, prisoner of war camps, theatres, cinemas, and canteen huts. So it explores how music of all kinds, live and recorded, was utilised to stimulate recruitment for diplomatic and propaganda purposes and for religious, educational and therapeutic reasons. So just to give you an outline of the chapter construction is here. So you can see by chapter the themes that I will be talking about. To save you the need for overnight stays, I'm going to just give you some highlights here. So I really started by considering what the civilian music scene was like in Britain at the time, because many hundreds of thousands of people earn their livelihoods by playing in house orchestras, the music halls, theatres and cinemas across the UK. Singing and the playing of instruments were appreciated, and there was an expectation that those who were capable should entertain. Fun fact, there were 3 million pianos in Britain in 1914, around one for every 15 people, and street singers were common. There were also more than 30,000 brass bands in the UK, subsidised by local employers, who performed in high-profile competitions. So the musical industries encompassing theatres, cinemas, music halls, music publishers, instrument makers and gramophone firms were employing hundreds of thousands of people and making a significant contribution to the national economy. But I became very interested in what happened to those musicians, civilian musicians, in the summer of 1914 as tensions mounted in Europe and Britain's armed forces were preparing to mobilise. But also the fact that little was known outside a very small group of insiders about how military musicians were trained in both the army and in the navy. So in the book, I won't go into it too much today, but I certainly look at how military musicians were trained and where and how they were deployed. So, for example, a lot of musicians, but not all in the army, were deployed as stretcher bearers, but a lot of them were in the infantry. On ships, musicians were often employed in the control room because they were seen as having a higher level of education and attention to detail and response and coordination. But other than that, the boys were employed as gunmen on ships. And of course, it's not until 1918 that the Royal Flying Corps become the Royal Air Force and they get their own school of music then. So the main obstacle I had to overcome was actually realising that the War Office and the Admiralty had very little to do with any organisation of musical activities, formal or otherwise. They were fighting the considerable might of the German Empire on land and sea and in the air, and British civilians were for the first time being killed on British soil. So for the music of the troops, not least for ceremonial, entertainment and recreational purposes, wasn't high on the government's list of priorities. The war was also expected to be short, so there was no anticipation of any need to change the way in which the British Armed Forces operated. And certainly no one in August 1914 could imagine how the war would develop into 4 years, 3 months and 14 days of attrition at incalculable human cost. So at the outbreak of war, this is the sort of image that people have, that bands of the Brigade of Guards did play every day for troops in the London barracks and on the and troops on the way to the stations, a Horse Guard parade and in Trafalgar Square. But among those new recruits was the 29-year-old composer George Butterworth, who was attending a recruiting office at Scotland Yard as he enlisted in the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. And he talks about reporting for duty at Horse Guards Parade, and they marched off triumphantly to Charing Cross Station, headed by a brass band and much stimulated by the cheers of the crowd. However, this was not the case for every batch of new soldiers. It was felt that there was not enough martial music, and that thousands of recruits had marched through the streets without even the sound of a drum to cheer them on their way. And this was the problem, in that all of the regular army units had sort of really disbanded their bands, and the musicians were either in their positions as stretcher bearers or shouldering their rifles as infantry. They carried on, so they left a bit of a gap of who was going to support, provide this musical support. And this man here, John Mackenzie Rogan, who was the bandmaster of the Coldstream Guards on the cusp of retirement, he's prevented from retiring, and he makes it his mission to make sure that certainly the British Army gets the music it needs. And this cartoon on the left here from 1915 is asking who forbids the bands. There's this feeling that there's not enough military music at all, and various newspapers like the Daily Telegraph start to raise funds to get retired military musicians back playing the new recruits to stations. But certainly where territorial and new army units were yet to organise a band, the local Salvation Army Band, of which there were over 10,000 members, were often the people who were called in to send the troops off. So again, I wanted to know what it felt, what did it sound like in 1914, early 1915, as these new recruits and reservists going off. And it was often the Salvation Army bands who were asked to step in, and many of whom ended up serving themselves. And again, the question of who established the bands in the new army units, as much as I could find, it was often the members of Salvation Army bands who joined together, who formed the nucleus of the military bands in the new units. And they did this very much under their own steam, and certainly much to the relief of many of their commanders. Because once they get to the front, there still is not much mention of music until 1915. Certainly organised music about playing men into the line, and it's Mackenzie Rogan who campaigns into 1915 to be able to take the Coldstream Guards Band and various other bands over on short tours of the Western Front to be able to play units serving on the Western Front in and out of the line. But as far as civilian performers go, it was the married couple Leen Engelen and Seymour Hicks, who by Christmas 1914 wanted to go and do their bit for the war effort. We see this with the mobilisation of certainly the London theatre industry, about how these singers and performers, actors and actresses could actually do their bit for the war. And you can see here, they're the first entertainers to go. They take a small party of well-known performers. You can see here, National Theatre at the front, Ben Davies, Gladys Cooper, Willie Frame, Ivy St Helier, William Van Allen, and there also is a cinematograph there as well. You can see here, they do take a cinema projection unit, and they go over to the Boulogne area, and they play to troops who have been wounded in recent action, certainly troops who have evacuated after the retreat of the Mons. So they various hospitals that they're allowed to tour under, owing to their personal connections to the War Office and the British media. So these are injured soldiers listening to the first concert provided by British professional performers, civilian performers who are going out there feeling that this is the only way that they can contribute to the war effort. But certainly different areas of the British military are very interesting, very instructive. This is 56th Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps, shortly before they left for France in 1917. This is the sort of the crack fighting squadron. This you've got Albert Ball here, and McCudden is here. But in the centre there, their commanding officer, Major Blomfield, was very, very keen on having the best musicians that he could. And certainly among his mechanics, he would swap out mechanics from other squadrons if he knew them to be good musicians. So 56th Squadron attained the best orchestra of pretty much the war by his very canny ability to go and pinch musicians from other areas. And certainly the Royal Flying Corps as a new service found music to be very helpful in many ways. I wrote an article a couple of years ago about how the Royal Flying Corps used song to enhance combat courage, because they all knew that most of them would die in horrific ways in very frightening situations, and they would actually sing about it while they were getting usually very, very drunk. But certainly as a news service, Sholto Douglas, who in the Second World War is very high up in the Air Ministry, he said that there was always a cheerful readiness to gather round and give voice to songs about flying. It was another of the aspects of the laying down of the tradition, and our songs became an interesting and often amusing expression of our way of life. And certainly that laying down of tradition, the Army to a certain extent already had that tradition, the Navy certainly did, but the Air Force did use song very effectively in many ways. But also it was fascinating, another personality that I met in the archives of the Imperial War Museum was this chap here, Captain George Miller Johnson. He was a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, and he had been previously head of the Birmingham Conservatoire music school. He goes and joins the Royal Flying Corps, and he said that the rigging on aeroplanes was tuned to a certain way. So if you were musical, you could hear if the cables on your aeroplane were tuned properly, if they were rigged properly. And certainly he talked in his memoir about piano tuners, from civilian life, being of great use and service in the Royal Flying Corps for this reason, is that they could hear if aeroplanes were in the right mechanical state by the sounds of the wires on the planes, which I thought was fascinating. Gramophones is a big thing. There's a whole chapter on gramophones, and particularly being such an enormous industry at the time. Gramophones were absolutely staple kit in dugouts, ships and aerodromes. Discs would be purchased at home and brought to the fighting fronts. I can, if you're interested, it's in the book, tell you exactly how many gramophone needles the Red Cross sent out in various shipments to prisoner of war camps and hospitals, and about gramophone sets themselves. And these were of great use. Obviously, this is not your average frontline photograph, but it does show how portable these gramophones were and how useful they were, and about how recorded music, the modernity of the technology that allowed this portable nature of music to do that. It was actually a really interesting chapter to write. And certainly this is officers' quarters at Holzminden, prisoner of war camp. You see the gramophone has pride of place here, and certainly gramophone concerts were very, very popular. And certainly when any escape attempts were made, often using music practice as a foil, as a disguise, which is there's some interesting tales in the book about that. The gramophone was the first thing to be confiscated from the officer prisoners. So it was it was a prized possession that they were very glad to have. I also talk about the therapeutic benefit of music, and certainly Henry Walford Davis, the composer who is the first head of music for the RAF in 1918, he very much talked about the therapeutic benefit of singing en masse, not only for the development of esprit de corps as part of the choir, but also there is a lot written, certainly by the Surgeon General as well, that I talk about in the book, about the physical act of singing, helping to clear the lungs of the effects of illness and also of gas. Also, it's interesting at this point, the Theosophy, which is a religion that a lot of the intelligentsia were members of, and composers like John Folds, who become quite prominent in the 1920s for his early work with the first festivals of remembrance. They believed that music could be used to heal the brain from shell shock, that shell shock as neurasthenia was being caused by the brain waves being disrupted by being shaken, and that music, the harmony of good music, could help heal those things. So that's very interesting as well. And there's also there was an American woman who I also mentioned in the book, who worked with shell shocked patients using early forms of music therapy. And certainly performers would go into hospitals. Certainly the YMCA sponsored concerts with Lena Ashwell. This was one of the members of the Lena Ashwell party. She was called Gwendolyn Teagle. She was a violinist. She was under 18 when she went to the Western Front with her violin, played for many funerals and to many dying men. And they would often go in and play to very seriously wounded men. The sights and the experiences of those performers were incredibly disturbing for them. But they did feel, as Lena Ashwell said here, into the hospitals we come with our music, into an atmosphere so impregnated with concentrated pain that at first we are almost afraid to begin, so strong is the impression of suffering. We take courage and we feel we bring a positive electric current, a mysterious magnetism to make the atmosphere vibrate to memories of happiness, love and joy. And certainly Gwendolyn Teagle with her violin, if someone was very seriously injured, she put the mute on. She talked about putting the mute on her instrument to make it soft there. But also there was some great material about how music was being used for fitness, for convalescence. And certainly at Trouville, there was a very active effort to get music to accompany physical exercise down on the beach for marching and for exercise. See bottom left. Singing constitutes a rest so that no slovenly attitude might creep in. The men stood at ease and held themselves upright. 4 or 5 popular choruses were sufficient. This forms a happy diversion after the various sweating away that they had been doing. But I've already talked about, mentioned the YMCA a bit more of them in a minute, but the Salvation Army had a great role to play in ambulances as well. They had their own ambulance section at Boulogne, where they cultivated a crack band, the Salvation Army Motor Ambulance Band under Bramwell Taylor there. They were very, very well known, very popular, and did a great deal to encourage the singing of hymns and worship, and sort of clean music as well that they talk about. There's a real sort of tension between popular and the sacred and profane. But certainly the YMCA did a lot of work into the YMCA because they were the people who were providing the space, the equipment and the performers in many, many areas. So the idea that the red triangle of the YMCA catered for men's minds, bodies and souls. So, they get a hot drink, somewhere to sit and write a letter home, a chat to someone, but there is a piano in every YMCA hut, and they are everywhere. So that's just one of the places. The old veteran saying, the place we wanted during the Crimea. It was thought that the YMCA was a top place to go. They were everywhere, the YMCA, everywhere the forces were, the YMCA would be. And this is the entrance to the YMCA, one of the YMCA huts in Ypres in July 1917. And this is what it looked like inside. So you can see the piano is there. And it formed, if anyone could to go on the piano, they would publish their own songbooks to encourage, the cleaner music, not so much the musical stuff, the cleaner music, the folk music. Annie Laurie would be a song you would hear very often. But the YMCA ran its own music department, and the composer Percy Scholes on the right was a great believer in the use of certainly the gramophone in musical education, and certainly his work after the war really concentrates on that. And this idea that if good music, or what was considered good music, and from the well-known composers was taken to the troops of all classes, then it was well received, as it was remembrance of home. But also the YMCA particularly worked with the music of other countries as well. So here's a picture of Chinese musicians, so the Chinese Labour Corps. Tens of thousands of Chinese labourers were brought in. Also the Indian Labour Corps as well. The YMCA believe they had a real civilising mission, but they don't. The tendency towards proselytization is always in the background, but they believed from a military perspective, from the forces, from the Dominion forces, the British forces, the Chinese, and the Indian labourers, that good discipline was kept if the men were kept nearby, if they were kept occupied and happy. So that was very, very important part of that. But also the difficulty in researching the Chinese and Indian men's experiences were difficult because not a lot of them were writing letters home, and many of them were illiterate. They weren't keeping diaries for the same reason, but also no one was sharing their oral histories either. You know, in the 50s, 60s, 70s that we see with British soldiers. So to try and get to their experience, I had to go through these agencies who were working with them, and still it's not satisfactory. And I hope I've only just opened the door for someone else to find some stuff on there. I've not talked about music and religion very much because, but again, it took me down avenues that I didn't expect to go. Certainly the chaplains. I don't think they always held services like this, but you see the chaplain standing up in the nacelle there with the band on the left at an aerodrome in 1918. Music was incredibly important for the religious aspects, and that sort of remembrance of home, that touchstone, the sound worlds of Sunday morning in their local churches could be replicated on the Western Front. But also hymn tunes were ready-made for soldiers to make up their own rather less sacred words. So what I've done with the book is I've really tried to look at how music of all kinds was very important to the war experiences of men and women who served in and around the British forces. Certainly, music of all kinds prompted the emotional remembrances of home by linking back to the sound worlds of comfort and family. Whether it was a bawdy musical tune, the phrases of a Chopin piano piece, or the strains of their own native instruments, through music, the soldiers were reminded of the homes for which they were fighting. But music was also a portable commodity that required minimal equipment. Tunes could be carried in men's minds, sung or whistled to memory. And those who organised and performed music on the fighting front understood that their raison d'etre was about taking music of home to the men for servicemen's enjoyment, but also their intellectual, physical and moral well-being, whether that was in France, Belgium, Mesopotamia, Egypt and beyond. So what I hope is the book shows how the wartime endeavours of British musicians served their king and country at every stage of the Great War. Music was not in any way ephemeral. It was unmatched in its power to cajole, console, cheer and inspire during the aftermath and its conflict. Thank you very much.